The hulking, powerfully built former Marine chuckled gleefully. It was a most unusual sight to behold. The source of his childlike mirth was the vast network of high explosives he had enthusiastically and covertly installed overnight, with the barely contained delight born of excessive force finally being cast aside. With an entire munitions depot at his disposal, he utilized every scrap of the ordnance smorgasbord available. This was an opportunity not to be missed. It was a masterful creation. Anti-personnel shredder mines, tank-busting bumpers, plasma poppers, high-explosive compression firebombs, gamma grenades, laser sprinklers, thermite daisy-chain claymores, and the affectionately named clusterfucks, a battery of white phosphorus airburst mortars. He was only slightly disappointed when not a single barrel of napalm could be found. Visibly trembling with excitement, the massive man peered over the foxhole he was crouched in. The hollow cam on its tripod dutifully recorded the event for later enjoyment, but that did not stop him from having a bin of popcorn, earplugs, and a beer hat helmet at the ready for the festivities. However, the rest of his squad were nervously watching from a much more distant, and thus safer, location, unwilling to risk joining him in what would normally be classified as danger close. They all agreed their unlikely human rescuer seemed to take an almost perverse pleasure in playing with an arsenal large enough to destroy a dozen battalions, with the sole purpose of destroying only the one pursuing them. This attitude was understandable, he reasoned, as they were civilians accustomed to those small bottle rockets and firecrackers, now banned for being too dangerous. The poor souls. They had lived such a sheltered, uneventful existence. In an effort to make them more comfortable with the upcoming excitement, he had thoughtfully added a small fireworks display to the end of the queue. The warband this trap was lovingly crafted for finally entered the kill zone, the last cargo transports and rearguard armor trundling across the threshold. The explosions began. The first two ranks of tanks were launched 50 feet skyward. A time-delayed plasma popper followed them up, entered the breached hulls, and melted the interior, detonating the munitions bays. This resulted in a spectacular display of 30 tanks exploding and sending molten steel rain in 360-degree spheres across the area. The steel rain was more for visual effect, as the blast wave killed or crippled most of the nearby troops. The observers, fortunate to have enough long grass between them and the kill zone, dove into the small gully behind them just in time. The next rank of armored personnel carriers fared no better. Laser sprinklers popped up, slicing and dicing anything in their range. Chunks of hot cherry-red metal tumbled to the ground, igniting small grass fires. These were quickly overshadowed by the massive explosion of the fuel tanks, sending enormous fireballs into the air and lighting up the entire valley. The observers, having gathered enough courage to peek over the hill, managed to see the fireballs. Infantry marching between the heavy armor were transformed into a neon green mist when the AP shredders rose to chest height and splattered the surrounding area. If one of the soldiers had been able to voice their thoughts as the first shrapnel-covered pipe bomb reached eye level, it would have been, "Oh, Those who had found their binoculars promptly vomited onto the ground, while those who were too late were not overly disappointed in missing it. By this time, the rest of the battalion had stopped advancing and reversed at nope speed. This set off the thermite claymores that flipped up in parallel lines to the armored command carriers, troop transports, and artillery trailers. Starting from those closest to the front of the formation, they shot walls of burning thermite balls in a 30-degree arc. As each of them detonated down the line, thermite coated every surface and melted through anything made of metal. Those that missed, which was most of them, due to how many were available, and the maestro's determination to use all of it, produced rows of lovely showers of red and orange streaks through the air. This was the first part of the symphony that didn't immediately horrify the observers. When the occupants of the command vehicles were exposed, high-X compression bombs sucked in and ignited the air in the surrounding area into expanding fireballs that encompassed most of the troops nearby. Those that weren't barbecued by fire or had their lungs sucked out of their mouths died when the visible shockwave burst their cells. The small appreciation for the red showers just previous to this was forgotten instantly, and those that had yet to loose their lungs generously donated their helpfully pre-digested evening meal to the local flora that was not afire, those that already had tried again anyway. The gesture was appreciated, and the flora were thankful just the same. Double rows of armor on the flanks of the formation swung their cannons around, desperately searching for a threat that did not exist at range. They shared the same fate as the first 30 tanks, with the only difference being that shaped charges shot them above and into the formation at a 45-degree arc before exploding in spectacular fashion. This was mostly missed by the observers who were still recovering from ralphing all over the place. The main body of infantry following behind were treated to more AP shredders and gamma grenades, the former painting the wide area with neon green gore, the latter irradiating everything with the curious side effect of turning the organic splatterings a phosphorescent green and casting an eerie glow on the smoke covering the OFA zone. The cargo transports were subjected to additional plasma poppers, which promptly ignited and melted. The rearguard armor followed the example of their now widely dispersed brethren, also being launched and exploded, this time in a forward-reaching fan formation that arced over the hellish landscape. The final touch was a carefully choreographed carpet bombing of white phosphorus mortars, blanketing the entire area with fiercely burning metal and billowing gray smoke. The grand finale turned out to be a brief fireworks display of 3 small flower shells that burst weakly, along with a few fountains of sparklers and some Roman candles. Compared to the main event, it was a rather pitiful show, if anyone had been watching, that is. The only reason it was visible at all was that most of the burnable material had already been consumed. As the terrifyingly intense display of high-explosive apocalyptic devastation subsided, the cratered battlefield was now strewn with the smoldering wreckage of main battle tanks, APCs, troop transports, the shredded and charred remains of the troops, and the supply column that had trailed behind, with clouds of debris and bright green and white-hued smoke beginning to clear. All eyes returned to the large man with drooping shoulders, who now appeared genuinely disappointed, almost sorrowful, that his extravagantly lethal display had failed to annihilate the entire force. Despite the sheer overkill that went into this carnage, a fleeting sense of sympathy formed in response to his crestfallen expression, only to be extinguished by the secondary detonation of the munitions truck the lone survivor stood beside. "Whoa! Hell yeah! Take that, you Xeno freaks! Yeehaw!" The horrified, vomit-covered spectators in the distant gallery were jolted from their stupor by the man's shockingly inappropriate cheers over the thousands of deaths he had caused. Upon returning to headquarters, the evacuees were treated for shock and minor injuries before being debriefed individually. Avoid any plans to invade human space was the consensus. These beings of pure violence are, in their own words, not to be trifled with. This human saying proved to be a vast understatement when the final words of the report were read to the government leaders. The silence that followed was absolute and deafening. Eventually, someone tentatively suggested a vote on the policy for interacting with humans. The result was unanimous, and the survivors' recommendation was approved. Avoid conflict at all costs. Failure to do so may lead to annihilation. The Gravitron rifle test was an unqualified success. A single shot into the advancing armored column obliterated the line. A sizable 20-meter hole was also blown into the mountains behind, as the supergravity warp field instantly consumed and atomized any material in its area of effect. The first sound heard after removing ear protection was the commander's jubilant cry. "Hell yeah! Did you see that? It was so damn epic!" "Sir," they said, "pew, pew, pew," and I was like, "V kaboom!" "Sir," they laughed uproariously, "say hello to my little friend, you bastards." The general, true to his name, fired wildly into the sky. "Sir, we've just received the unconditional surrender from the enemy command," came the report. General Wild Willie Rogers paused mid-celebration, much to the relief of the engineers frantically trying to shut down the supercapacitor array before it melted down. "I can't shoot them anymore?" "I'm afraid not, sir." "Not even once?" "No, sir. That would be considered a war crime." I should point out that we received the surrender before you decided to celebrate the successful firing of the Griff, and that the sky brightened as the perforated burning hulks of several battleships screeched overhead, plummeting to earth wreathed in an angry inferno of superheated plasma and metal. Multiple sonic booms echoed through the mountains as the broken ships breached the atmosphere, and the cloud cover seemed to leap away from the howling mass. The general, his second-in-command, the technicians for the Griff, the support staff, and the platoon of Terran troopers turned as one to watch the flaming wreckage disappear on the other side of the valley, and collectively flinched when it impacted the ground with a thunderous boom. The glow of superfires put the mountains in sharp relief for a few moments, and the assembled humans observed the rather spectacular night scene in awed silence. Shortly thereafter, the reactor cores overloaded. Night turned briefly into day, and the humans were spared from permanent blindness and hearing loss by the mountains shielding them from the intense nuclear detonations. The light quickly faded, and several mushroom clouds were revealed by the radioactive hellscape below and the aurora above it. The radiation burst, ionizing the atmosphere. Ejecta hurled back into the sky by the explosions rained down on the surrounding landscape and ignited even more widespread fires. Several pieces massive enough to send a noticeable tremor through the ground beneath the stunned observers, despite being several dozen kilometers away, and shaking loose a series of avalanches on several of the slopes. The wreckage of enemy ships to your left, the resulting casualties for which you are personally accountable with your Yosemite Sam Scarface-esque display, could, as mentioned earlier, be interpreted as a war crime. However, since the surrender offer was documented as received by our forces, you will likely face arrest and trial. Well, that's the gist of it. You should be all right. The first appearance of the enemy occurred in Texas during an ill-conceived and poorly timed invasion on Thanksgiving. It was first contact with an alien species, if you count viciously beating them to a bloody chunky pulp as first contact, and the general consensus was that it went rather well. There were a few casualties in the beginning, mostly due to the element of surprise, but it was the horrific death of Bowser, a baseball coach's dog, that sparked the berserker rampage responsible for cleansing the small town of invaders before the army could even show up. The commander in charge of that army group ordered a bombing run on the alien responsible for the dog's death as soon as he heard about it. His second-in-command tried to dissuade him, reasoning that scrambling an F-16 to firebomb one already dead alien was a huge waste of taxpayer money and overkill besides. The commander rebutted, "Son, it's not about the money, it's about sending a message. There's casualties in every battle, but you do not kill a man's dog, period. It's a bloody war crime in my book. These sons of bitches need to know we are not to be fucked with, and if I could drop the bombs myself, I would. That honor goes to his owner. The man deserves to send that creepy-crawly bastard straight to hell. Call him over, will you?" "Are you weeping, sir?" "It's pouring, you fool." "No, it's not." "Ah, indeed it is." Everyone agreed it was a perfectly reasonable reaction, especially considering the repulsive appearance of the enemy, to say nothing of their savagery, and it would remain the most memorable part of the invasion. Xenobiologists had a great deal of fun engaging with their peers in the sci-fi community. They basked in the attention with justifiably smug grins, enthusiastically sharing their discoveries with the media without anyone mentioning little green men in patronizing tones. DARPA had a field day when several hundred tons of alien technology was delivered to their research labs in the form of dropships, and they began examining them with a completely understandable lack of professional gravity. Like children on Christmas Day, they were unabashedly excited. Many unrestrained expressions of delight were heard as they unwrapped their presents. A few years passed, and on each anniversary of the invasion, millions of people would happily pulverize hairy, multi-eyed monster piñatas before settling down to a nice turkey dinner. One year, the piñatas were foregone when the second invasion was attempted by a significantly larger and varied force. Some had thicker exoskeletons, some were faster, some had venom, and some were just bigger. Hordes of them invaded, destroying cities and crawling over the rubble to pursue us. They failed spectacularly. Everyone knew they would probably attack again. If they were too stupid not to gather intel on us before invading the first time, they would no doubt be dumb enough to try again. So as a rule, most people carried some type of item that could be used as a blunt weapon. Baseball had surged ahead as the most popular sport, and intermissions were frequently filled with both teams' mascots chasing around an invader mascot with oversized bats and Acme hammers. An entire industry had been created to cater to this need, and everyone had a great deal of fun personalizing their weapons of choice with various decals, flashy, exotic materials, and smash tones, customized sounds that would play with each strike. The old Batman TV show was a goldmine for this. Reinforced umbrellas, canes, and bats adorned with a delicate pink glitter were a popular choice across age and gender groups. When the second wave came, their owners gleefully set about beautifying by fabulous force any monster foolish enough to come within range. The fittingly comedic kapow, sock, splat, bap, biff, boff, and blammo. Sound effects accompanied each pain screech. To them, it probably seemed a perversion of nature that they should be the ones to fear us. Given how hideous they were, it probably was, but that just made the mayhem all the more satisfying. Despite the thorough drubbing and complete rout of enemy forces, the adage, "it's all fun and games till somebody gets hurt," was unfortunately true here. Other parts of the world, with a few exceptions in Europe, did not share American enthusiasm and were thus not suitably prepared to repulse a second incursion. They suffered tens of thousands of casualties as a result. The pressure was on to take the war to the enemy and finish it on our own terms. We set to it with a will, cooperating with other countries in a global effort to reverse engineer the enemy's technology and construct the first United Terran Fleet. We had been attacked twice without provocation and were determined to ensure there would never be a third. In a little over 5 years, we had completed the fleet with only a minor hiccup, where an overzealous scientist took himself and a sizable portion of Uranus with him when his prototype warp engine sent the lot into the higher dimensions. He became the butt of many jokes, and whenever one of his colleagues made an ass of themselves, they were duly lampooned as their foolish selves. Starship Troopers and its spin-offs enjoyed immense popularity during this time, but the few voices cautioning against full-blown xenophobia were drowned out by the fervor. That changed when we came across the first handful of alien civilizations brought to ruin by the enemy on our search for their homeworld. Blind hatred was tempered to cold fury by the sight of once vibrant planets, teeming with life, overrun and enshrouded with the nests of the enemy. We did our solemn duty and bombarded them from orbit with carefully aimed asteroids, swearing oaths to come back and salvage what we could and honor their memory once our grim task was complete. Graviton Canontelli, it seemed the enemy had only taken over a small fraction of the Milky Way, so it didn't take too long to eliminate them. They hadn't bothered to hide their tracks, so it was easy to trace them back. When their homeworld was found, we thoroughly destroyed it in the name of Bowser. It didn't matter that they wouldn't get the message since they were all dead. It was the principle of it. A few years later, an entrepreneur decided there was money to be made in having large memorial asteroids available for anyone with the cash to hurl them at the radioactive slag heap of a planet. His lone venture created a thriving debris collection industry and had the unintended side effect of saving several previously unknown species from extinction via giant space rock. Now that the enemy was vanquished, we turned to exploring our new backyard and found our neighbors much to our liking. Most of those had kept to themselves, but had a modest intergalactic economy. They traded between themselves in a rather friendly manner, rarely in conflict aside from interspecies sporting events, which could get quite violent after a few drinks. We fit right in. The novelty of first contact with new species never really got old, and we always had a blast at the Welcome to the Universe parties. A ship full of intoxicated aliens was guaranteed to make them unforgettable, especially when someone turned off the artificial gravity and turned on the disco ball. With the spoils of war, we were able to expand established trade routes far beyond the Milky Way to thousands of other galaxies and ushered in a prosperous new era. Humanity became extremely wealthy when we introduced every species we met to cheesecake, chocolate, and pizza. Over the course of 25 years, we made hundreds of new friends along the way for obvious reasons. Cultural exchange in particular was something we relished, but it was the mythology of several species that caught our attention. The first of our new friends had heard rumors of a hostile force slowly spreading into our galaxy and had interesting reactions to the news of its defeat. It turned out they were thought to be a part of some ancient enemy that supposedly came by every few dozen millennia and apparently offended by any alien life daring to exist in the same universe as them, destroyed anyone they came across. Legends spoke of an unstoppable force, and only the most desperate of our ancestors' friends had survived the last purge by fleeing to untouched systems and burrowing into a random planet where they remained for centuries until the danger had passed. We listened politely, but it sounded like the kind of fanciful tale mothers used to frighten their children into obedience. However, as more and more species were found to have similar histories, we began to take the matter seriously. A threat capable of wiping entire galaxies clean of life, only to vanish without a trace, was not something to be dismissed lightly. In any case, it provided a convenient excuse to keep decommissioned warships maintained as patrols, which kept trade routes safe, rescued ships in distress, and made good use of their firepower to eliminate travel hazards in the vast emptiness of space around warp beacons. Decades passed, and eventually we decided the threat was not worth worrying about. There were too many other perilous cosmic phenomena that curious civilians and bored engineers were eager to investigate. Black holes in particular became popular racetracks, drawing crowds of aliens who came to witness the insanity humans subjected ourselves to for entertainment. Then a colony went dark, then two, then four. Soon the darkness was encroaching upon our borders, extinguishing warp beacons at an alarming rate. The change happened so swiftly that no word of what had occurred managed to escape. Our sphere of influence was being slowly consumed by a veil of darkness. Amidst this panic, Bobby Montague Sterlington, the overzealous scientist who had vanished over 60 years prior, suddenly reappeared in the exact spot he had left, which was now quite distant from the Sol system. The chunk of Uranus he had taken with him had been transformed into a giant toy dinosaur. When questioned, Bobby would only say that the original materials were dull, and he had decided to do something about it while he waited for the warp bubble to return to our dimension. One rather foolish young engineer was particularly captivated by Bobby's experience and persistently pestered him to recount his time in the higher dimensions. Bobby eventually agreed to share his tale, but only aboard the very ship he had used. A few hours later, the young man emerged from the vessel in a state of distress, his mind seemingly overwhelmed. The doctors who examined him tried to uncover what had transpired, but he could only curl up and plead for the imagined tormentors to cease their assault on his psyche. Suspecting Bobby had tormented the poor boy simply to silence him, the Alliance Council ordered an investigation. Bobby, clearly anticipating this, simply provided the same recording he had shown the young man. He warned the security chief that any holotape filmed in higher dimensions carried a strange property that made anyone who watched it experience the events as if they had been there themselves. Despite the apparent absurdity, the security chief wisely ordered one of his subordinates to view the tape. Mr. Shortstraw watched it and soon joined his distressed comrade in a padded room. Of course, this raised questions as to how Bobby had managed to maintain his composure after having endured that same ordeal for weeks on end. "I'm not an idiot," he said testily, adjusting his electroshock thinking cap. "I'm a physicist. I know things get screwy the farther away you get from our dimension. I'm the one who had to stare at the damn math for weeks before it happened. Those two weren't and didn't. One was an electrical engineer and the other was a security guard. They'd react the same way anyone would if it was real. Besides, I also know the things that live in the higher dimensions can't actually touch us. They're not really real. It's just an extremely terrifying illusion that violates the laws of nature in the worst possible way. I mean, sure, the freaky bastards nibbled on my mind a bit, but I came out all right, didn't I?" It swiftly became apparent that he was quite mad, harmless, so long as you didn't touch his towel, but nuttier than a squirrel's stash on a drunken octopus in the midst of an acid trip. The brass decided it would be best for everyone if Bobby was confined to the top research vessel that bore the name Necessity. Bobby was displeased with this arrangement and expressed his discontent through various petty acts of retaliation, the mildest of which was referring to the ship as Nessie to irk his superiors. He was just settling into his new lifestyle when the first of the volunteer scouts limped their way back to report the cause of the mysterious darkenings. Only 1 out of 63 scouts returned, but the intel they relayed was well worth the cost. A vast fleet of unknown ships were responsible for the attacks. Their massive supercarriers, spanning 50 kilometers in length, were bulbous in shape and painted a deep crimson. The capital-class vessels were dark wedges, adorned with grotesque war masks, their swarms of fighters resembling obsidian talons. Unmistakable malevolent laughter was broadcast on all frequencies whenever they entered a system. But that wasn't the worst of it. The most perilous ships were unarmed, yet their number grew to 6. Colossal behemoths, dwarfing even the Earth. Their ominous presence foretold only doom. They would ponderously scour fallen systems, devouring worlds whole by ripping them to pieces with gravity beams. They spat out billions of tons of slag and birthed countless ships. Like a plague of locusts, the world eaters left nothing in their wake but the dross of their victims. Fleets of very familiar ships also accompanied them. The enemy had returned with its masters, it seemed. The ones we had so doggedly pursued and exterminated with extreme prejudice were obviously just the first wave. We had bloodied their nose, and they went running home to Daddy. Rare eyewitness accounts from courageous scouts told of all resistance being ripped apart by those deadly black shards, followed by the systematic slaughter of any and every sentient being. After the mass killings in plain view from orbit, where millions of people were eaten alive to feed the enemy monsters' breeding swarms, we knew they knew we were watching. They were sending US a message. When our new allies laid eyes on the intelligence, they were overcome with trepidation. The ancient enemy had returned. Paralyzed by fear, they proved ineffective in battle, unable to retaliate against what they had come to see as nightmarish foes. As it turned out, this was for the best. Humans were among the few capable of mounting an effective defense, and the only ones to have developed nuclear weapons before venturing beyond our homeworld. In fact, we possessed substantial stockpiles of these weapons. The people of Earth rejoiced, seeing an opportunity to achieve nuclear disarmament through their use in war. Humans were known for being unconventional. To our allies, we were akin to the platypus, a peculiar creature that somehow carves out a niche everywhere it goes, adapting the survival traits of other species or inventing new ones. We could be both endearing and dangerous, depending on the circumstances. When they discovered that our brains seemed to have their upper and lower halves rotated 180 degrees, with the two hemispheres split, they nodded in understanding. "Ah," they said, "that explains everything. Only a strange being like a human could test nuclear weapons, thinking it might ignite their atmosphere, and then conduct 2,000 more tests when it did not." Unsurprised by this revelation, our allies were content to let us handle the combat side of the conflict, while they focused on supporting the war effort through construction, supply, and maintenance. With the knowledge of how the previous genocidal campaign had unfolded, we redoubled our efforts to advance and uncover new technologies. Our patrol ships were our first line of defense, once again throwing themselves into the fray, engaging in the deadly dance of real-life Galaga. Vast fleets of alien vessels engulfed the human cruisers. Their brave crews fought to the last, activating FTL drives just before they were overwhelmed. Thousands of enemy ships were destroyed by each superluminal kamikaze strike and the resulting warp shrapnel, but it did little to stem the tide. Since direct confrontation proved suicidal, mine-laying corvettes and destroyers armed with nuclear weapons, railguns, and lasers were ordered to harass the fleet's edges and attempt to whittle down their numbers. 20,000 nuclear warheads were not enough against a foe numbering in the billions, and the enemy had ships to spare as the humans lost vessels rapidly. The scientists knew they needed something more powerful, with greater range and area of effect. Improving lasers, ships, engines, and shields would have little impact against an enemy of such vast scale. That's how Bobby saw it. His colleagues were thinking too narrowly, likely because they were aliens who had spent millennia in relative peace. Bobby and his excited colleagues made their case at the next War Council, proposing slight improvements to current technology that they proudly presented as revolutionary advancements. I engineered an engine surpassing the performance of all others by 6%. I crafted a shield 7% more robust than the previous iteration. I developed a massive flamethrower that launches colossal orbs of stellar plasma, many times the size of planets. The trend of one-upmanship faltered somewhat after that meeting. There was now a method to Bobby's madness, and it was only then that he was given near unfettered access to resources. The brass knew they needed someone who could think outside the box, and Bobby was not only outside the box, he wasn't even aware of its existence. Multi-dimensional travel had a way of doing that. Also, the military had a soft spot for big, explodey-type stuff. Units were cranked out as fast as they could be made, and crews were trained quickly. Bobby had made an appearance in a training video for the Stellarwerfer operators that included a demonstration of lighting a fart on fire. It never failed to get a laugh, and some kindred soul added an extra feature into the system programming that transmitted various fart sounds over all frequencies whenever the weapon was fired. It worked marvelously at first. Tens of thousands of enemy ships were incinerated with each ejection. It almost looked like a fire breather was torching enemy ships for a circus performance. Like moths to a flame, they came and died in droves. For the first time, we were actually kicking some ass. The fart thing must have pissed off the enemy, because after the first few engagements, they massed so many ships the stars behind them were blotted out. Wave after wave of ships was sent to their fiery deaths, until at last the Stellarwerfer machinery overheated with continuous use and destroyed itself. Then the World Eaters came in and ate the star. After the first loss of a Werfer system, they got smart and had the World Eaters churn out small, unmanned drones by the trillions, and quickly swept aside other installations with contemptuous ease. Bobby was pretty pissed about this for two reasons. His weapon system was easily overcome by a simple strategy of overwhelming numbers. The enemy was going to further disrupt his plans by cutting off the gas. He could also see how things were progressing and said, "I'll be damned if I let them do that to Saul. Bring me my device of doom." He decided a Pyrrhic strategy was necessary. The first part of Bobby's Pyrrhic strategy nearly got him lynched. He was relieved he had decided to make the second part the first one. Otherwise, they wouldn't have let him live. It was a bold idea, one that any previous weapons designer would have considered ingenious. Bobby named it the Tallywhacker. They're just going to consume our worlds anyway, so why not make them choke on it? This made a strange kind of sense to the aliens, who had never thought of doing something like that. At least, until he explained how he would do it. They thought he meant coming up with a way to stop their worlds from being consumed, so there would be something left to return to when it was all over. The naive innocence of those unaccustomed to being so hopelessly outmatched. The notion of using the metal cores of planets as single-use projectiles was pure madness. Bobby retorted, "Think about it. Wresting control from the unforgiving jaws of fate, depriving them from fulfilling their evolutionary purpose, making a mockery of their very existence. That is the purest form of revenge anything doomed to be killed can hope to achieve. Sometimes you have to be bold, even if it means getting trampled. We're going to get trampled no matter what we do. I say we force it down their throats and see how they like it." Martyrdom and spite were alien concepts to them, but once they understood, they became ardent supporters of the project. Bobby decided to let the bit about it being madness slide, given that he was able to live. He was sensitive about being labeled as crazy just because he had brilliant ideas no one would ever consider. With only slightly wounded pride, he got to work on it. He made a point of incorporating a rubber chicken into the design and hard-coded the extremely appropriate AC/DC song Big Balls to play when the system activated. Just before a system was to fall, a specialized fleet of ships would warp in perfectly aligned with the largest concentration of enemy ships, and with the planet in question perfectly centered at the back of the formation. Each vessel was essentially a giant hypercapacitor connected to a directional electromagnet. All were linked to a control unit that carefully managed the enormous energy needed to accelerate a core to 3% of light speed. When the incredible power was unleashed almost immediately after the warp, the planet's core would be ejected from its confines at 9,000 kilometers per second, carving a path of total devastation through the enemy forces. The remainder of the planet would then implode, eliminating any remaining life. It was the largest, most destructive projectile weapon in history. No shielding could ever hope to stop a 992 caliber bullet. All one could do in the face of a 2,440-kilometer diameter slug of white-hot nickel iron was brace for the inevitable. Bobby took great satisfaction in the viscous expressions on our alien allies' faces and their savage cheers. They finally grasped the value of fighting back, no matter the odds. His alien colleagues, who had witnessed the first firing, promptly gave up trying to surpass him. Their only consolation was the certainty that Bobby himself could not exceed this feat. As for the enemy, the whole affair left them thoroughly perplexed. The maneuvers of their ships alone made it clear they were utterly flabbergasted. They had never encountered the concept of spite before. The weak were meant to flee the strong in mindless terror, as was the natural order. Some weaker prey did surrender and accept their fate, but they never dared to strike back. Not a race so obviously the god of death. It was unthinkable that anyone would dare attack an unstoppable force. And yet, here were these insane, lesser life forms lashing out in the most desperate of ways, using garden worlds as ammunition, even their own homeworlds, to retaliate. Their moment of confusion was a costly one. Before they could recover, several supercarriers were simply gone. There was nothing left of them, not even debris. The heavy losses quickly taught enemy to spread out their forces when approaching a system, and only bring the World Eaters in when the battle lines had been pushed a few hundred light years ahead. Yet the next blow would be unimaginably stronger. The tremendous success of the Tallywhacker paved the way for Bobby's next creation, the Nova Bomb. No one could make heads or tails of the physics involved, but so long as it worked, understanding the finer points could come later. In his presentation to the War Council, he showed a short simulation of the sun on the left half of the screen and empty space on the right. To illustrate how pitifully weak fusion bombs were, he demonstrated what one would look like when seen from the same distance as the sun. Most of them missed it the first time, and he had to highlight the area before they could all see it. By that point, the project's approval seemed a foregone conclusion. They all knew what a supernova was, and any respite it could grant was welcome. Yet Bobby was nothing if not a showman, and he'd put a fair bit of effort into whipping up a snazzy presentation, adding an industrial space heater and some serious sound effects to make the experience more immersive. After all, watching a supernova from this close would be impossible since it would kill you. This was the only way to watch it happen, and a little artistic license was acceptable. He didn't tell his audience about it, though. To truly understand the tremendous gap in power, he had to zoom out to the orbit of Mercury. It only took 20 seconds for the sun to swallow the planet whole with a hellishly dire howl from the devil, coming for your soul to torment and abuse in unspeakable acts of cruel depravity for all eternity. A blast of intense heat hit the viewers right when the fire reached them, stopping just short of actually burning them, completing the terrifying illusion. Several of the councilmen were visibly shaken, but the project nonetheless received unanimous approval, on the condition that such an incident would not be repeated. The first use of the Nova Bomb was postponed until 2 of the 6 World Eaters were poised to consume separate red giant stars. Prior to deployment, Bobby donned his suit and personally adorned the bombs with creatively worded curses, ensuring to include insults relevant to various aspects of the enemy's existence, so that they might fully grasp the abhorrence in which they were held. Unaware of the peril they faced, the 2 factory ships had mere seconds to detect and react to the changes in the stars just before they detonated. The blast wave, traveling at 30,000 kilometers per second, annihilated them in a cataclysmic explosion of unprecedented scale. A wall of nuclear fire, preceded by a deadly burst of gamma radiation, rapidly expanded, its dimensions soon becoming unfathomable. The planets of the system were swallowed up without discernible impact, not even the gas giants. The blinding inferno continued to grow, engulfing the entire system along with 714 million enemy ships. The reactions among the refugee fleet varied widely, from fear and revulsion to awe and ecstasy. Those aliens nearby who understood the situation simply shook their heads. Of course, the humans would find satisfaction in this. With no other enemy battle groups within range, the enemy was thrown into disarray as they tried to determine what had occurred and plug the gap in their defenses. The resulting chaos in enemy forces allowed us some respite to gather resources and preemptively evacuate people in the projected path of the enemy's advance. Millions of previously doomed individuals were able to escape thanks to this double-edged outcome, but it came at a heavy price. Whenever the surface of a star churned and swelled as if afflicted by indigestion, whenever coronal mass ejections lashed out like fiery whips, raging at the universe, whenever the star suddenly expanded, swelling far beyond its previous size, whenever the massive wave of hard gamma radiation cooked any nearby life, whenever the star violently exploded and consumed its system in a raging inferno, whenever the blast of a solar hurricane stripped planets of their atmosphere and boiled away oceans, whenever this silent harbinger of death was unleashed upon the enemy and friends who could not escape in time, a small part of the human soul perished with each star. Our alien companions understood the rationale behind the move, but they still deemed it excessive. Some even resented us for leaving some of their people behind in the frantic retreat from the blast radius. We watched the terrible beauty of the infernal blaze consume entire enemy fleets, and we lamented having to extinguish the source of all life. It felt like a heinous act. Light was meant to be a metaphor for all that is good, and here we were doing the work of Sauron by snuffing it out. Only the fact that the enemy was worse than him made it bearable. Unfortunately, the Nova bomb proved less useful than one might have hoped. We could only employ it once per star, and even with the billions of them in each galaxy, we would eventually, as unimaginable as it may seem, exhaust our supply of stars. Nova bombs succeeded in incinerating large areas of the ancient enemy, leaving only scattered atoms and expanding gas clouds, but their usefulness was short-lived once the enemy learned to keep their FTL drives charged and ready to escape the shockwaves, which only traveled a tenth the speed of light. We were saddened by the fate of the dying stars, as the ferocious energy that rendered planets sterile for light years went to waste if no enemy ships were destroyed. To further hinder the enemy's manufacturing, we destroyed every star we encountered, diffusing the stellar mass to the point where it was no longer economically viable for their world eaters to gather resources. The beautiful nebulae created by this scorched space retreat eventually disappeared from sight as the stars were extinguished. It was a bittersweet victory, and we took no joy in it. It was easy to forget that each star likely had orbiting planets, some of which may have harbored life. Countless innocents snuffed out by our strategic moves. The architect of this collateral damage, Bobby, refused to use his given name, instead declaring himself Dr. Bobby Monster, seemingly unaffected by the weight of his actions. Admittedly, it was difficult to discern. Bobby once sank into a deep melancholy when someone managed to thwart a prank and avoid using the toilet he had rigged with ketchup packets under the seat. Not even his personal ball pit could lift his spirits. Capitalizing on the vast debris field of stellar remnants left behind, Bobby's fourth WMD was capable of causing far greater destruction than the N-bombs themselves. The concept occurred to him while singing a favorite song in the shower, a common locale for many revolutionary ideas, and proved to be a true stunner. He dubbed it the most brutally metal weapon ever created. The Shocker, also known as Zeus, made its debut in truly spectacular fashion. As the enemy fleets were traveling through the supernebula, several billion megacapacitors vented their pent-up energy and unleashed the mother of all storms. Bolts of lightning surged through the exploded innards of stars, illuminating the gore cloud. Huge lances of electric death crackled as they struck, with enemy ships acting as literal lightning rods. Trillions of amps slagged systems, and the 17 billion ships we had lured into the trap were charred to a blackened crisp. Shields fell, navigation went haywire, ships collided, hulls ruptured, containment fields failed, antimatter reactors destabilized and exploded. In one fell swoop, a fifth of all enemy forces were destroyed. Millions of people had been traumatized by the unstoppable dark tide and the countless lives that had been sacrificed in vain to stop it. The Shocker ended that. Our leaders knew this would be a significant boost to the flagging morale that was weakening more and more the longer it dragged on. The enemy had taken to decorating the hulls of their ships with the corpses of the poor souls who didn't make it. They decided to approve the obscene expenditure more to address the morale problem than the military feasibility. It was a bitter pill to swallow, but when Bobby pointed out that this was the first time the ancient enemy had resorted to this level of barbaric psychological warfare, and that it was a sign we were making them worry enough to try new tactics, it went down a little easier. It also helped that they could appease some of the species who had historically worshipped their home system stars. It could be said that their gods struck out even from beyond the grave to avenge their followers' deaths. It was truly a one-time arrangement. The immense resources invested in its construction precluded us from squandering our limited and diminishing reserves on a second such device. Yet they had obtained their objective. People responded to displays of power, and the shocker had accomplished what N-bombs could not: provide front-row seats to an awe-inspiring demonstration of human ingenuity. Budgetary constraints compelled Bobby to devise a weapon that did not necessitate substantial fuel, such as fissile material or stellar mass. "The sole thing more frustrating than lacking sufficient ordnance," he grumbled, "is a black hole. Mikhail was a charlatan. The conservation of mass is nonsense." Thus, the next superweapon he conceived was dubbed the Singularity Bomb, a fusion of a nova bomb, a warp engine, and a plastic dinosaur. Queried as to the dinosaur's purpose, he simply responded, "For reasons." The device spawned black holes, and that was all that truly mattered. They were a terrifying sight to behold. Even light itself, traveling at nearly 300,000 kilometers per second, could not escape their irresistible pull. The distortion of light bending to their whims imbued them with a sinister aspect, hinting at the true depths of their monstrous power. The fabric of space-time was distorted to such a degree that the rules of physics broke down at the center. FTL travel was impossible within 1 light hour of a singularity due to the gravitational distortion in the local space-time. Death by black hole, it seems, can take an eternity and be excruciatingly painful. Such was the fate of countless enemy ships and crews. These S-bombs were a double-edged sword, an incredible hazard, but only if victory was achieved. Military strategists decided to worry about the consequences later and pressed ahead with widespread deployment. S-bombs proved remarkably useful, though the battlefield had to be abandoned after their use, as it became too dangerous for either side to remain and fight. They saw more action as mines than as warheads, their careful use forcing the enemy to spread out their forces and evening the odds of ship-to-ship combat. Bobby, the brilliant but eccentric scientist, was underwhelmed by the S-bomb's capabilities, finding the earth-shattering kaboom of nova bombs more impressive. He retreated to his lab for therapeutic hydrogen balloon explosions and violent video games, leaving his co-workers to mutter, "That boy ain't right," during their lunch breaks. The enemy eventually tightened the net, forcing a retreat to the last galaxy under our control. It was then that Bobby turned it up to 11, his division enjoying a massive budget for much of the war, though even that was sometimes insufficient when he requested things like a dozen elephants for his experiments. The fleet quartermaster dreaded the inevitable shouting matches with the nutty professor when his requests were denied. The last row had followed the refusal to provide a gram of antimatter for a super-duper mega top-secret project, completely unrelated to the microwave in the break room that also needed replacing for the second time that week. The two of them eventually made amends. They both recognized the other as a crucial component in the war machine, and it was counterproductive to fight amongst themselves. After all, Bobby was the best GM in the fleet. The weekly Dungeons & Dragons game was about the only time people could relax and escape the harsh reality. There was never a dull moment in a fantasy world created by a madman. In the real world, there was one request that was comparatively innocuous to such absurd things as elephants. The item in question was actually quite common, but it had a significant impact on the fate of the universe. "Sir, requisition from the necessity. It's another one of those. For the love of... what is it this time?" "Lanthanides, sir. A lot of them." He sighed, reaching over to the comm, and called Bobby himself. Quartermaster Hank Wilson knew he wasn't going to like the answer to his question, but he asked anyway. "How much do you want?" "I need about tree fitty." "Tree fitty? Tree fitty what?" "Tree fitty billion tons." "God damn it, monster, I ain't got tree fitty." "Then give me what you have and get started on the rest. I've only got 2 more tricks up my pants, and the last one is really crazy." "For the 100th time, monster, pants go on your legs." "No, I like having pockets by my head. Besides, I am wearing pants on my legs. Anyway, never mind that. Are you going to get me what I want, or what? What's it for, anyway? You know the Death Star?" "Yeah. This next one is going to make that look like a pea shooter. I'll get started on it." Anticipating the inevitable last stand, Command had begun mining the borders of a system near the core of the Redoubt galaxy with singularities. The system was specially chosen for its unique makeup, with an M-class star half again the size of Sol, orbited by 12 worlds. 2 were habitable, and several other planets and moons were rich with resources. It would make an ideal stronghold. Intended to sustain the surviving populations while the brightest minds sought a way to prevail in the war, the system would be sealed off from the rest of the universe behind an impassable wall of black holes, indefinitely. They would never depart the system, but it was preferable to extinction. After the main fleet had arrived, the final section of the barrier would be completed, leaving only a narrow corridor of safe space in case complete isolation proved unnecessary. 14 years after the request, 3 specialized fleets warped out to unknown regions beyond the reach of most. Their mission was one way, with volunteer crews. 2 years later, the refugee armada concluded its long retreat. Just before the system was sealed, 258 massive freighters were slowly towed into position around the gas giants. The last-minute rush of supplies had been stockpiled for nearly a decade, hoped to suffice for construction and experiments. As the final defensive measure was about to be emplaced, a message arrived from the volunteer crews. They were ready. Bobby breathed relief upon receiving it, postponing the mine deployment and activating his second most destructive weapon, God's post-Curry No. 3, the Eye of God. A massive ring thousands of kilometers wide surged with roiling meta-energy, creating the first artificial wormhole. But that was only half the feat. The connection on the other end unleashed a torrent of holy fire, atomizing anything in its path and breaching the black hole barrier. Unlike the single, planet-destroying super laser bursts of the Death Star Mech 2, the Eye of God's continuous near-light-speed plasma and antimatter hurricane could destroy an entire world every second, indefinitely. In the silent vacuum of space, the truly fearsome weapon of utter annihilation would subconsciously evoke a sense of dread in any observer. Our alien friends were greatly relieved we were not their adversaries. Dr. Bobby Monster had become both the most celebrated and feared individual in the universe after this achievement, surpassing all conceivable levels of destruction and mayhem. When asked about it, he cryptically remarked, "They ain't seen nothing yet, hopefully never will." Privately, Bobby expected the respite to last a year or 2 at most. The wormhole had been relatively simple, but stabilizing the other end and funneling a relativistic jet through it was the tricky part. He was certain the enemy would eventually discover the machine precariously positioned above a supermassive black hole, and destroying it would be easy. To buy more time, he had sent other teams to different locations. Powering a laser or particle beam strong enough to compare would have been impossible, so this was an elegant solution. 2 game-changing forms of travel and 3 of the 5 most dangerous phenomena under my belt before 40. Not a bad showing, if I do say so myself. Now, if only I could harness the power of my ex-wife's ire. He doubted he could blame the enemy for 30 years of mortgage and car payments, even if they were the reason for his absence. Martha wasn't stupid, just unconventional. Who arranges the toilet paper that way? Maniacs, that's who. And everyone thought he was the one who was unhinged. "You're wasting your time," she said. "You'll never do anything great," she said. "Stop poking at those stupid equations," she said. Ha! In her face, Martha! Still, it was best to leave that can of worms unopened. He settled on trying for the 5th most dangerous one. That nut would be infinitely easier to crack. Worrying about it right now would only bring him endless trouble, so he did as usual and played some video games until he forgot about it. Then he would work on his final project. Tonight would be an excellent night for drinking. He was rather proud of his cleverness in avoiding the energy cost problem. He filled his boot with homebrewed hooch, fresh from the still, and began to sing. "Come with me, and we'll be in a world of pure inebriation." Bobby's estimates were accurate. The enemy did find and destroy the first team in a year. They managed to send the signal to the second team, and they did successfully establish a wormhole. But once the enemy knew what to look for, they were quickly found as well. The last team knew they were going to die soon when the signal came, but they did their job and opened the final wormhole. Time was running out to find a solution before the last free peoples were sealed off for eternity. At length, the eye of God closed. God himself had not paid any attention to what was going on in all of creation, and was currently watching reruns of The Littlest Dreadnought. Just outside the black hole net, we could, with the help of computer-aided gravity lensing compensation, make out the supercarriers blooming and disgorging their deadly cargo from the main hangar bay at the center. Troop ships, the first we had seen, were sent through the gap in the millions before we could seal it. Orders were given, and what was left of the Space Navy threw themselves at the enemy, desperately trying to buy the civilians time to enter the vault. Great steel doors in the crust of Bastion closed behind the last ships to enter the hollowed-out planet. It was unknown how long we could survive, but it was not likely to be more than a few hours. Imagery from surface receivers showed us the brave souls who had remained. We did not witness their final moments, as they were obscured by the swarm. It was not long after that the first enemy dropships arrived. Only then were we confronted with the true visage of our scourge, the ancient enemy. Only now was the horror fully realized. Elongated, pale white faces, oversized red noses, glowing red pupils in the vast blacks of their eyes, wide mouths filled with razor-sharp teeth, oversized heads adorned with vibrant hair, pear-shaped torsos, thick-fingered hands itching to choke the life from people, shrouded in ruffles at the wrist, baggy striped pants held up with combat harnesses, and footwear so large it reduced their movement to a waddle. They were a caricature of evil personified, and their attack hounds, the eight-legged freaks of nature we had fought before, spewed from the gaping maws of their masters, completing the living nightmare. As if that were not enough, the crazed laughter and honking they emitted was more debilitating psychologically than if it had been blood-curdling screams. They swarmed into our tunnels, the corridors echoing with malevolent mirth and squeaky shoes. Bobby took one look at them and completely lost his composure. The phantom demon clowns that had tormented him for weeks on his dimensional escapade were real. This time, they would not be restricted to gnawing on his mind. They would probably devour him alive, and he would feel every agonizing moment. That is, unless they wished to torture his soul before consuming it as well. Absolutely not. He took advantage of his colleague's distraction and slipped out with a few things he needed to complete a weapon he had never wanted to build. Now he did not care. A few minutes later, one of the scientists turned away from the walking nightmare, unable to bear it any longer. He suddenly noticed something was missing, an extremely important something. He frantically shook the lead physicist's shoulder to get his attention. "Stop shaking me, damn it! What is it?" "Sir, the margarita jug is gone, and the quantum field generator has also vanished." "Oh, that's rather bold of them, even if the world is—" "What? That's an incredibly delicate device. You can't just take it. Where is Dr. Monster?" Blast it, Monster!" Everyone scrambled to find the mad scientist and stop whatever he planned to do. The unknown destruction he could wreak with the stolen tech he had long desired, coupled with the 2-gallon jug of booze, was a terrifying prospect and a welcome distraction from the demon murder clowns and giant spider monsters coming to kill them all. Back in his private lab, Bobby was putting the finishing touches on the most destructive weapon ever devised. It consisted of the stolen generator, scavenged components from 3 singularity bombs, several antennas, the break room microwave, a calzone, and copious application of the most useful substance known to man: duct tape. Theoretically, it should work, but the odds of it failing were uncomfortably high. There wasn't any time to test it. This was going to be the greatest Hail Mary in history. If it worked, no one would be around to know. If it didn't, everyone would die a horrible bloody death, and countless multitudes of people would have died for nothing, himself included. There, it was finished. Now all he needed to do was hook it up to the Nessie's antimatter reactor. Getting the contraption down there unnoticed would be difficult. He had been banned from going anywhere near it after the first microwave incident. It would have been very difficult, that is, if he hadn't spent the last 10 years building a secret passage to it. The parallels to the 20th century movie The Shawshank Redemption, one of his favorite movies since his travel ban was enacted, were deliciously sweet. He took down his life-size poster of his childhood hero, Han Solo, and wheeled the jerry-rigged contraption down the dimly lit passageway, hidden behind it with a whispered, "Odds be damned!" No one could locate Bobby in time to intervene. They searched the entire ship, except for the one place they knew he would never be, the reactor core. Eventually, they realized where he was. The diversion of power from all systems made it hard to miss. But reaching him in the dim emergency lighting, with several blast doors in the way, would be a difficult and futile task. Hank Wilson and the scientists huddled around the video link to the reactor room, trying to convince Bobby to stop his actions. When that failed, Hank resigned himself to the inevitable and asked what Bobby had created. "This," said Bobby, stepping back to admire his deadly creation, "is my greatest and most terrible work, the pinnacle of human achievement, the ultimate tool of destruction." He turned to the camera, holding a makeshift detonator, and grandly proclaimed, "Gentlemen, I give you the apocalypse bomb." There was a shocked gasp from the bridge. Hank was the only one who could find his voice. You mean that thing is going to destroy the entire universe?" "Yes. I've had enough of those unsettling beings to last a lifetime when I cross dimensions. I refuse to live in the same universe as those abominations. And if I can't live in it, neither can they. I'm going to go out in the brightest blaze of glory since the Big Bang." After a moment of silence, Hank spoke up again, with more conviction than he thought possible. "Hey, Bobby." "Yeah?" "Kill him with fire." "That's the plan," Bobby said cheerfully, toasting his friend. "See you on the other side, buddy." Bobby shifted his monitor to the feed showing the demonic horde closing in on their prey, eager to witness their faces as victory was snatched from their grasp by a lesser creature. Their reaction would be priceless. Bobby grinned wolfishly as he gazed into those malevolent eyes. "Yippee-ki-yay, motherfuckers," he muttered, draining the last of his margarita and pressing the button. The pitch-black chamber housing the ships lit up as petajoules of energy surged into the apocalypse device. Prismatic sparks of light seemed to appear at random points in space, as if a swarm of iridescent fireflies had decided to put on a final display. The glowing lights in various colors brightened in tandem with the gathering energy at the core. Families huddled together, finding comfort in the beauty of their impending demise. In the labyrinthine tunnels above, the enemy paused its advance, unable to comprehend the phenomenon. Normally, they would simply push forward, certain that nothing could stop them. But this new iteration of life had proven the most troublesome they had ever exterminated. In 13 cycles of cleansing over 6 billion years, no lesser race had weaponized indomitable forces like stars and black holes, nor shown such stubborn refusal to yield, even to the point of destroying a star to deny their foe. This propensity for creative destruction on an unrivaled scale had given the enemy pause, filling them with a growing sense of alien dread as the light intensified. In that resplendent moment, a deep rumble resonated throughout the chamber. It was the groaning of 6 dimensions being twisted and bent in ways they were never meant to endure. The very foundations of reality were shaking. Only in this place, surrounded by black holes distorting the fabric of space-time, could this phenomenon occur. The laws of physics protested the gross violation, but were firmly disregarded. Where there was atmosphere to provide a medium, those with auditory organs heard a high-pitched whine akin to an electric charge building. Those with olfactory organs detected the scent of marshmallows and ozone. Those with taste buds thought the air that passed over them tasted of oranges. Those with eyes saw double, then triple, then kaleidoscopic hallucinations. Facets of reality took on new properties as rules were cast aside. Tendrils of arcane energies shot out from the center of the device, suffusing the network of dark matter that marbled the universe and tapping into the pool of dark energy. They flexed, tensed, and contracted almost instantaneously. A psychic lurch of epic proportions was felt by every sapient being in the universe when the 6th dimension cracked like an egg, and 95.1% of all the matter in the universe dragged the other 4.9%, 2 trillion galaxies and change, along for the ride, forcibly condensing everything to a single point in the blink of an eye. A flash of the purest white light obliterated everything for a split second. Darkness, and then there was light. The load on the reactor lifted when power was no longer needed by apocalypse bomb, signaled by the ding of the microwave. Bobby's calzone was done, perfectly uniform in temperature, Clenched eyes were slowly opened, tight grips on loved ones released. There was an afterlife? How could there be an afterlife if the entire universe was destroyed? These questions were put to rest when they looked out the viewports and saw stars. While everyone else was busy thanking whatever gods they believed in, Bobby sat in front of his equations back at his lab, scratching his head, trying to figure out what happened while the other physicists finally arrived and tentatively examined the apocalypse bomb. With only the knowledge that they were alive in what appeared to be a universe, and a massive hangover from the post-apocalypse party, he eventually concluded that some kind of localized distortion field had preserved them when Ragnarok kicked off. Their bubble of compressed space-time had been punted to an alternate universe with the energy released from the destruction of the previous one. The only notable difference was that body parts would occasionally go out of phase and slightly sink into whatever they were touching if you spaced out for a bit. The sensation of pins and needles that grew the longer you were out of phase was a helpful, if uncomfortable, reminder to focus. Aside from the obvious implications that quantum physics was about to become very intriguing, this was a revelation, albeit half of one. He was so excited with the evidence of multiple universes that he immediately set about creating theoretical models and methods of further testing. When it became clear that the only way to tell for certain was to blow up this universe, Hank put his foot down. Requisitioning the very universe everyone was living in was a step too far. I don't care how cool it is. You don't get to blow up a perfectly good universe just to sate your curiosity. Well, I wouldn't do that. Don't be silly. Put the other one away, boys. Hank eyed the mad scientist suspiciously. Good, he growled. Leaning over to close the link, he was interrupted by his comm officer before he could disconnect. Sir, we're being hailed. What? From where? We're in deep space. There's nothing around for light years. All around us, it seems. Multiple directions? No, sir. I mean, I can't tell where it's coming from because it's being transmitted through every point in the fabric of space-time. I see. Shall I put it through, sir? Whatever. We just survived a universe blowing up. Another impossibility is par for the course. Beep. Hello! Oh, good. You figured it out. Hi there. My name is Bob, and it looks like you just destroyed one of my universes. I didn't even think that was possible, but there you have it. Anyway, what gives? You see, the thing is, look, I may have all the time in the multiverse to do things, but seriously, get to the point. An all-consuming plague of demonic space clowns that barf out giant spiders was trying to kill us all. So we decided if we were going to die, we'd take them with us. And we accidentally got sent to this one when we blew up our old universe. Really? Yup. Huh. I guess that's what happens when I leave a sim running and forget about it. What? Oh, nothing. Nothing at all. Cough. Well, that's all right then. Wouldn't want them going around eating people. Just don't go blowing up this one, okay? It's the main universe. I've put a lot of time and effort into it, and I'll be very cross if you cock it up. Okay? Brilliant. Well, I must be off. Lots of godly things to be doing. Toodles. The line was cut, and Hank was left with a look of utter bewilderment on his face that was mirrored by the scientists he had been haranguing in the bridge crew. He cocked his head and went over the conversation a few times to pick out the important bit. We're living in a video game, aren't we? He asked Bobby. It would seem so. There's a theory that our universe was a hologram. Does that mean he can delete us whenever he wants? Probably. Well, shit. Not much we can do about it then. I guess we just keep calm and carry on. Bobby was incensed by the defeatist attitude. Fuck that. Get to work, boys. I want to hack the universe and find God mode. I didn't escape hell just to die at the whim of some egotistical jackass. The balls on this guy. That filthy shizno forgot about us entirely, turns around to scold us, then forgets us again. This high and mighty prick obviously doesn't know humans are not to be fucked with. And that was how we, the immortal peoples of Apocrypha, took over the primary universe.
You have reached the end of the story. If you enjoyed this story and want to support us, please leave a like and subscribe to our channel. And for every comment that says 88, I will heart every single one of them. Thank you for your time.